I'm really excited and honored to introduce Heron.
I want to send a big thank you out to all my friends at Mountain Rose Herbs for this honor. And I also want to send a big thank you out to this place and to all the people who have tended this place for so long. Mount Pisgah is actually a place that I've been coming since I was a really little kid. So I grew up in this area, this landscape, these open oak woodlands here, this river running through this beautiful riparian forest. This is a place where I've come and learned so many plants for the first time. This is a place where I come in nature camps as a kid. I also came here when I was first an herbal student as a teenager. Colette Gardner took me here. And I also came here in my early 20s when I was a college student studying botany. So this place has been extremely foundational in my own evolution in growing into my relationships with wild plants and wild places. In addition to that, I want to send a piece of gratitude out to the First Nations people who have this place as their home. And I just want to honor the countless generations that came before us that took care of this place in a reciprocal relationship. And I want to honor that the absence of the Calapooya people here today is what is allowing our presence here. And I would love to just spend just a moment inviting you to think about something you're grateful for in this moment. Is there anything in the natural world that you've seen today or recently in the past week that sparks your sense of gratitude? So, I'm curious, anyone here today has ever felt a sense of disconnection with themselves, with other people, with their place that you were born or raised? Anyone? Yeah? Yeah, me too. Has anybody ever felt kind of a vague sense of loneliness or lostness, of not quite knowing where you fit in, not quite knowing how to participate in this world that we were born in? Have you ever felt that? Me too. It's no coincidence that many of us have these feelings kind of ongoing throughout our life because the mass culture that we live in right now, the culture of industrialized civilization, we're living under a false pretense of disconnection from our place and from the natural environment around us. And see, we have this kind of weird privilege of being able to get most of our physical needs met from an infrastructure that allows us to not really see where those needs are coming from, where those resources are coming from, right? So we need a glass of water, we just turn on the tap. Where'd that water come from? It came through a pipe somewhere, but somewhere on the earth there's a watershed with trees and creeks and rivers that's giving you that water. And most of us don't know that place, where the water that we drink comes from. And how about our food? Most of the time, we are used to living in a situation where we can have our favorite foods whenever we want it, wherever we want it. In fact, if we're used to eating at chain restaurants, we could go anywhere on the continent and get the same food. This has never happened before. In the history of human beings, this is a very new phenomenon, that we have the ability to eat food and get our resources in a kind of homogenized way any time of the year, at any place we go. So it allows us to not have that direct relationship with the things that are feeding and sustaining our bodies and also our cultures. And it's held up by a very thin veneer, So when we don't have these relationships with our natural environment, with the things that sustain us, it's like we actually don't have a reason to have a relationship right now because everything's so easy, right? So we could get away with living our whole lives not knowing any of the plants that grow around us, right? No problem. You just go to the grocery store and buy some carrots. You don't even have to know where carrots grow or what their leaves look like. So as I've been living my life, I've come to realize that this kind of false disconnection is a pretty fundamental pattern that I'm interested in changing in my own life. And I think that if I actually change my life so that I have direct relationships with the plants and the resources that feed my body, that direct relationship that I have gives me a reason to then care about those resources that are feeding me. And it's like I started with gratitude, right? When I start with gratitude, that opens my heart into actually an awareness of a connection that I have with other beings. And that's what I want to keep coming back to. And it's this reason, having a practical reason to have a relationship with the plant beings and the other wild ecosystems that will allow me the ability to slowly kind of unravel myself from these comfortable systems, these false life support systems that are around in the industrialized world. I'm interested in slowly, little by little, becoming less and less reliant on these false systems and becoming more and more reliant on my direct connection with the things that sustain me. This talk is a little window into maybe one possible step towards that direction. And it's really guided by the question of how do we live in right relationship? Or how do we live in connection with our environment? How do we live in balance? And, you know, if I imagine living the way that I'm living right now, or the way that our culture is living right now for another 100 years, I can maybe imagine it going on for another 100 years. But could you imagine going on for another 500 years? Could you imagine this way of life going on for another 2,000 years? How about 10,000 years? I mean, the farther I get into the future of trying to imagine our society continuing, the more preposterous it seems. So clearly we gotta figure something else out, right? I don't have all the answers, but pretty sure the direction is reconnection. So in finding this truly long-term way of life, I am interested in looking at a few things. One of the things is the wisdom from my own ancestry and reconnecting to the heritage which I come from, which has been disconnected through various processes of global colonization and migration. And I'm also interested in looking at the indigenous lifeway, the way that people have moved throughout this landscape right here, because this is my home. So I want to know how have people lived with this landscape throughout time in a way that, you know, it may not have been like perfectly in balance, but sure seems a lot more in balance than what we've got going on right now. This is the indigenous land of the Calapooya, who lived traditionally in the Willamette Valley, and some of them still do. They had a lifeway that moved throughout the seasons in relationship with all the wild plants and animals, in timing with them so that they were cued in to what was going on with the resources that sustained them, and they were there at the right time and right place to harvest them. And this is a picture of Calapooyan people digging camas, which is one of the main staple foods of many, many indigenous groups throughout the western part of this continent. And it's an incredibly valuable, starchy carbohydrate in that little white root down here. And probably many of you are familiar with this plant. You might not know its name, but it blooms abundantly all throughout Eugene and the Willamette Valley in probably April or maybe May. And so how the Calapooyan people would live is that they gathered in large groups in the wintertime near a river or in the lowlands. And the wintertime is a time of crafting, of repairing tools, of gathering and telling stories and connecting with all your loved ones that you haven't seen throughout the year. And it was usually a pretty large group of people. And then when the springs would come and the roots would start blooming, like the camas and many other foods that they would gather, they would go out in smaller bands, maybe a dozen people or so. And throughout the growing season, they would be gathering and harvesting plants as they walked from camp to camp, and they would be preparing them and storing them for use throughout the rest of the year. And not only were they gathering these foods and storing them, but they were also engaged with the plants in a way that helped those plants thrive more. So this is a direct tending relationship. A lot of times we think of hunter-gatherers as just being people who wandered aimlessly and just got whatever they could, and it was kind of a meager life. But the indigenous people actually had a very intentional, highly developed system of managing and tending their resources. And they did so with such intention as to help the things that they survived on to flourish. And in the actions that they did, that flourishing also helped a lot of other life forms flourish. And so the presence of human beings on the landscape was a presence that helped the whole landscape be more diverse and more abundant with life. So some of the things that they did, I'll just mention briefly, is right here they're digging. And they're digging with digging sticks. They're not plowing the ground and turning over large heaps of dirt with a bulldozer like we do these days sometimes. Just a little pock in the ground, lifting up a root, and what that does is it tills the soil. But it tills in such a micro way that it doesn't disturb everything that's growing there. It just tills the soil a little bit, it puts some more aeration in there, and it exposes bare soil, which then new seeds from those plants can fall into, and that bare soil allows the seeds to germinate. And it also stimulates little reproductive cloning mechanisms that these plants have to grow more. Kind of knocks them off their parent root, and then new plants can survive. And in addition, one of the other main things that they did to tend the landscape is the intentional use of fire. By setting fire to the landscape, they kept the habitat at a particular stage of ecological succession. And it's a very diverse habitat that depends on fire. It's kind of like what you would see right here. This is a really good example of a fire-adapted habitat because we have large oak trees, which are fire-resistant with a large diameter trunk. There's not a lot of low branches to the ground, and you just have a grassland. And if it was managed by Calapooyan people, it wouldn't be only grass, it would be full of wildflowers and bunch grasses. And so the fire would just move down along the forest floor, along the meadow floor, and it wouldn't really burn up the trees, it would just go quickly through the trees. Also, people would plant back. People actively collected seeds and planted them back where they wanted them to grow in a very intentional way. So this way of life that I'm describing, this is known as the hoop. And this I learned about the hoop from my teacher, Phoenicia Medrano. And she learned about it from Paiute and Modoc elders, which were her teachers. And the hoop is a pattern of a semi-nomadic, seasonally migratory lifeway. And it's lived by our indigenous ancestors in many places across the world. And every place is going to have a different kind of hoop. So there's different plants there, and there's different peoples there. And so the culture of the people and the actual geology and the geography and the plant life of that place mixed to create what the hoop was in that particular place. But it definitely is rooted in this migratory way of life, like moving from place to place in relationship with the wild things that are growing there. Most of the hoops nowadays have been broken. It's not a complete system where you could just go out now and just live in a seasonal migration and walk the walk and then you're surviving. It would be way harder to try and do that in this modern world at this time because the resources that were tended so well have been degraded from neglect and from conversion of land use and all kinds of things. This is a graphic from the Paiute people's way of life, and this is from out near Steens Mountain, which is in the way southeastern corner of Oregon. And what we see here is the months along the outside, showing the wheel of the year. And then on the inside, there's some major plants that were really important food staples to these people. And We see camas here in July. Camas blooms later out there, by the way. And the mule deer in the middle, that's basically saying mule deer all the time. We like mule deer all the time. And down here in the summer, we see huckleberry and ponderosa pine nuts in the fall and whatnot. I think this is a simplified pictorial version of a really complex Lifeway, but I think it's a really valuable tool, and it's something I want to work with more during this talk. But how is it relevant to us? I mean, we can't go out and live that way now, so what can we learn from this? This is a picture of me digging camas out in Eastern Oregon. And my suggestion around how we use this information currently is around each one of us taking responsibility for a personal shift in worldview and a personal taking on that job of relearning or reconnecting with our physical environment around us and just doing whatever we can to reestablish the relationships with the wild things that we live with. And just acknowledging and being present with the fact that we depend on each other. And all this false pretense of buying things at the grocery store, that's false. Even though maybe we'll keep buying things at the grocery store, just to reestablish this sense of knowing the wild things around us is really important. And this is a worldview shift towards one of seeing ourselves as part of everything around us, right? It directly conflicts with the kind of civilized worldview, which is a lie based on separation. And in that way, it's really world-changing work. It's like the personal work that we can do to help shift the kind of unbalanced way that we're living. It's also really important at this point for me to say that I believe that this earth is doing fine. I think that this earth is alive and well, and there's so much life form on this earth that even if a lot of them die, the earth is so creative that more will come. And so the reason I think for reconnection is not for some kind of nostalgic view of needing to save the earth or be an environmental hero. The reason to do it is because it feels good in my heart when I do it. It feels good to me when I know directly the foods that I'm eating and directly the resources that are feeding me. And it's this way that I'm lifted up and the joy that I feel that is the reason to do it, and it's also the foundation of reciprocity. Because in ecology, if we look to the study of ecology, we see that all living creatures change their environment, right? Everything wants to make the environment better suited to help that organism survive. And sometimes these different organisms will change the environment in a way that supports the diversity of a lot of other things also surviving. And sometimes they change the environment in ways that will kill other things. And that's okay too, that's just, or they're making kind of preferential changes to the things that will benefit them most. And one of the good examples of that is beavers. Beavers are an animal, they build those big dams. They could take, say, a stream in a forest, build a dam, and then the water floods, it kills all the trees, it kills maybe it's a meadow and they raise the water table, so it kills the grasses, new plants come in, but the environment that they create is much more diverse than the one that was there before. And beavers are kind of a foundation, well, they're what's called a keystone species in that way, where the things that they do to change the environment, a lot of other creatures rely on that environment that they change. And I believe that human beings, with our awareness and our consciousness, can play a similar role to the beaver. Beavers are good allies in that way. And we have in the past, when people on this landscape were living on the hoop, they had a similar role of creating more abundance and diversity from the changes that they consciously made. So, what are the ways that I can consciously shape the world around me through my own desires, for my own desires to meet my physical needs and my cultural needs? How can I use my own desires to also shift the world in a way that's beneficial to the rest of the living life web around me?